I'm curious to know how humans started. Did we start from a single cell or were we descendants from apes? What is the real truth about how the first single cell began?
Shall we say this? Manifestation moves, shall we say, downward from a higher form into a condensation. First of all, there is unity, a single framework that is unified in the wider context. One says this is the realm of the gods. Of course, the God becomes more individualized into different frameworks, different gods taking on different qualities, different purposes, different responsibilities. And so that descends into another framework, shall we say, of the individual motivation. And at this point, it begins to hold, shall we say, conceptual ideas. Each one of such conceptual ideas manifests in terms of, shall we say, frameworks of existence. That is, first of all, before you build the building, draw up the concept, the architect, and shall we call them the planner, creates the drawing of the building in its environment, in context. And so that imaginary form begins to take shape. Next, you give it to the drawing person who puts measurements on the framework, begins to make it more, shall we say, real in practical terms. That is, first, the individual imagination begins to take shape. And individual manifestations and shapes begin to interact with one another. One takes on, shall we say, an identity. Identities interact and cause, shall we say, agreements to take shape, and you begin to manufacture a three-dimensional solid world. That is, still it is not solid, but it interacts and sets a framework in which one can operate. Do you understand? Even as it is, there is no dimension of history, no time, as it were. This is the first quality of, shall we say, a creative mind. As it begins to descend yet again, the interactions take form in terms of, shall we call them, shapes and interactions and sensates. That is, one rubs up against one's friends and foe, as it were, those that are in agreement and those that would want to change your particular style. And so that is a more solid form, often called the astral body, solid and operating within a set framework. One is not then delving into the imaginary, but one is interacting with what is sensory. And so it moves down as consciousness settles into a physicality. Under the circumstances, the physicality begins to solidify into terms, shall we say, of solid substance. However, the solid substance, in order to remain, shall we say, consistent, has to have an element of time. That is, it stretches into the future, and as such must have stretched into the past. So now you have a future and a past, and one has then, shall we say, to identify the length of time of a incarnation that is into solid form before one returns to a higher aspect to, shall we say, contemplate the experiences and what one has accumulated in terms of knowledge. Do you follow what I mean? Then one has to have a past from which one imagines. So then one has to create the ideas of, shall we say, continuity. Continuity requires birth and death. Birth then requires a mechanism. Then you have a mechanism, and so on and so forth, all the way back in time, making sure, of course, that one's knowledge is getting less and less and less over time frames into the past. Eventually, of course, you have created a history all the way back as far as you can, and then you begin to make assumptions in terms of the animal kingdom and so forth and so on, and it is all the product of an imagination. Do you understand? Whether, of course, you are the result of an imagination of some future. Do you understand what I mean? Some future original descendant, all the way back. So your history is simply the fleshing out of knowledge in a mechanism, in a way that brings consistency and coordination and contingency to the entire experience of, shall we say, a God's descent into solid form. This is not then that one simply emerged from a beginning, but rather one descended from, shall we call it, a future, a way back, in order to build a sensible operating procedure.
Mm.
This is the soul meeting self. All the way back into the distance.
Mm.
Do you understand? It is not as if solid anything, but it is apparent solid form. That is important in order to recognize that the solid nature must have, shall we call it, continuity or patterns. So human beings, humankind has recognized patterns from, shall we say, from the beginning of time. And then as new knowledge appears, shall we say, the old is systematically modified in order to answer the new information. So, shall we say, is the past stable? Of course not. It is constantly being updated, just like your computer system, constantly updating the old in order to serve the present moment.